joining us now to discuss Nicaragua, Venezuela, and anything else that might come up is Max Blumenthal. Max has been on the show before. I consider him a friend of the program. He is free to disagree. He is the senior editor of the Gray Zone Project, which can be found at grayzoneproject.com. He's the author of a number of books, including Goliath, his book on Israel, and his other book on Israel and Palestine, The 51-Day War, Ruin and Resistance in Gaza. Are you still also co-host of the Moderate Rebels podcast?
Definitely check out Moderate Rebels at SoundCloud, YouTube, iTunes. It's me and Ben Norton almost every week if we can make it.
Okay, well, that's the kind of scheduling I like. So you started to tell me before we went on the air, but the Gray Zone Project, the name.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like a hair club for men.
Don't get personal now. All right.
Hey, I got my own issues with that.
Okay.
But basically, it started out as my own initiative at Alternet, and what we wanted to do was kind of fill a void in progressive media where we were doing real or investigative reporting and original journalism that other people on other sites on the left really weren't substantially doing. At the time, I felt like something horrible was going to happen as a result of America's policies in the Middle East, as a result of the kind of endless war on terror and permanent war, and also because of the Islamophobia industry that had formed in the U.S. And so I called it the Gray Zone Project, based on a paper that had been written by a kind of a pre-ISIS ideologue, this Takfiri ideologue who had talked about the extinction of the gray zone, and he called the gray zone the area in the West where Muslim immigrants in the West could kind of cooperate and enjoy coexistence with the Western population, and that it had to be extinguished in order to disrupt the Muslim population and force them to to make hijra, or to take sanctuary inside the Islamic State. And basically, it was a recipe for encouraging Islamophobia and right-wing politics. And I think we were really onto something, because I consider this formula of the U.S. being in the Middle East, stirring up all kinds of crises, and an Islamophobic, multi-million dollar Islamophobia industry in the U.S., stirring up hatred of refugees and immigrants, as a big factor in the rise of Trump, in the success of Brexit, and the rise of the far-right populist movement in Europe. And so we named it the Gray Zone Project, and it's continued on. It's no longer really a project. It's a fact of life that many people are extremely unhappy with, because we started after Trump's election to challenge not only the Russiagate narrative, but we've also challenged the push for U.S. intervention in Syria and various other dangerous policies, what we consider dangerous policies. And so we've seen in a lot of the congressional testimony around Russiagate these supposed information warfare experts who are basically counter-terror hucksters who are repackaging themselves in the Russiagate era, talking about gray propaganda and gray zones of information where the internet has to be purged of certain sites. We've actually been falsely accused of being a Russian-backed site by various supporters of intervention in the Middle East and heightened tensions with Russia. And so I thought the gray zone label was still appropriate because of this new initiative among the sort of centrist censors who are obsessed with this concept of fake news, which we can talk about more in the show.
I'm happy to, yeah.
Cracking down on what they consider to be gray areas, which is really their code for, dissident websites and information that's inconvenient to the empire.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. And I've been fascinated by the fact that that ever since the first opening shot in this Russiagate narrative, which was the Clapper report, which I thought, I've read intelligence reports before, an extraordinarily A, shoddy piece of work, B, even by the flimsy standards of the United States intelligence community, entirely undocumented, and C, clearly targeting left-wing dissidents or challenges. I mean, the criticism of drone warfare and marginal
Fracking and
fracking. So it's been clear to me that this has been, in my view, a campaign to crush dissidents and enforce conformity of thought, and the fact that shoddy non-thinkers like Malcolm Nance are elevated to national positions. Now, I went on the Young Turks recently, and I got some social media heat from people saying things like RJ Eskow is usually a reasonable guy. What happened to him? Because I said I wouldn't be surprised if some sort of shenanigans took place involving trolls, or that might have been based in Russia or whatever. But that my theory is that if any activity went on where Russian activity intersected with the election, I felt it could the gravest description that could be given to it is that they were expecting to troll Hillary Clinton and annoy her a little bit before she became president with some stupid memes. I don't know. But what are your thoughts on that?
Well, my thoughts could take up the rest of the show and longer. I mean, there's so much to say.
Yeah.
You talked about the Director of National Intelligence January 2017 report that singled out two defunct RT shows, one hosted by Abby Martin, and accusing them of fomenting radical discontent. That was, the content analysis of those two shows comprised 1/3 of the key document in Russiagate that had been used, and it only found with high confidence that Russia had interfered. That high school level content analysis was really the basis for the narrative up until Mueller released his indictment of the Russian hackers, which is now seen as the most credible document. And it is much more detailed than this pathetic DNI report. One detail in the Mueller document, though, that I think hasn't been really mentioned is that according to Mueller's intelligence, which I think he's relying on Dutch intelligence, the code that the supposed Russian military intelligence agents implanted in the DNC's system, the servers that they took out inside the United States through a VPN, they were purchased early in 2015, before Donald Trump had even declared his candidacy. So how that really works against the collusion narrative, that they weren't even anticipating Donald Trump being president. The other issue is that on election night, the New York Times had a graphic on its site, and I remember showing it to all my friends who supported Hillary Clinton, that Hillary had a 98% chance of winning. And remember, it kept going down. Oh no, it's 42%. Oh no, get out the hard liquor. Why would the Russians, Russian military intelligence, and Putin in particular, have initiated an attempt to antagonize the person who is most likely to be president, unless they were extremely stupid? So there are all these questions that remain, but I think that there may have been some interference. Maybe there was, but compared to what we are doing and what the United States did to Russia today, I hate to say it, but it's elegant. It looks elegant compared to what the United States did to Russia today, which is to impose illegal crushing sanctions aimed at hurting Russia's middle class in order to spark some kind of color revolution or undermine support for Putin. Economic warfare on Russia's population on the basis of an unsolved crime, which is the Skripal poisoning, the poisoning of Sergei Skripal, a former Russian spy who had no value to Russia anymore, in the town of Salisbury, England, which the British police have still not solved. It is completely unsolved, and there's so much that we've learned about it that works against the narrative that Vladimir Putin personally ordered it. But on the basis of that poisoning, the State Department has determined something that the British police haven't yet determined, which is that Russia is guilty, and unless they apologize, we will ban all flights from Aeroflot, the Russian state passenger airliner, and basically ban all imports and exports to and from Russia. Just a full-scale attack on the Russian economy on the basis of an unsolved crime out of the blue. And I mean, imagine if a more powerful country did that to the United States. and the dollar started crashing, as the ruble is crashing right now. And the Fed had to let the dollar float because it didn't have cash reserves. Just imagine.
And bear in mind for our listeners that economically Russia is tiny compared to the United States, with maybe the size of Italy, its
it has
economy,
1/10
Spain.
the economy of China.
Right. So I guess, I think it's an important topic, and somebody has said to me the other day, you've always been a Russia skeptic. And my answer is, I'm an everything skeptic. It's my job to be a skeptic. So the Skripal thing, the Sergei Skripal, I've actually tried to follow that closely in the British press, where it's getting more attention than here. And what I struggle with there is that the best explanation the British government has come up with for why the Russians would poison Skripal, and maybe they did, I don't know, but the best explanation I've been given was to instill fear, terror in the British population. And I would think, well, there are so many better ways to instill terror in the British population, if that was their objective, that aren't confusing.
Then why wouldn't they have gone after,
the Prime Minister, a crowd of people?
Some British boy band or something. There's so many people that could have been hit. And then, you saw somebody fooling around in a dumpster near Portendown, and they got poisoned as well. So is Russia just like randomly throwing Novichok in dumpsters? The key point, though, and this also it's the same scenario we saw play out in Syria with the supposed chemical attacks, which sort of triggered the red line. Is anytime the Syrian army was advancing and driving rebels out, there'd suddenly be allegations of a chemical attack, which triggers the red line that necessitates military intervention from the West, and military intervention was the rebels' only hope of surviving. So it seemed kind of convenient there. And here you had Russia on a charm offensive right ahead of the World Cup. One of the most important, I think, pieces of Russian PR in 2018, probably in the last decade. And you could even call it an aspect of Russian soft power. Having a successful World Cup was probably the most important thing to Putin since the Sochi Winter Olympics, certainly. And then they decide to just randomly attack some former spy who had already expended his usefulness in Salisbury, England, with a chemical weapon. How does that make sense? I mean, that has to be the stupidest move that you could make for someone like Putin, who's accused of being this brilliant FSB mind who plays 13-degree tactical chess on the West and is always 100 moves ahead. So it really just didn't make any sense from a political PR standpoint at all. It did make sense from the point of view of someone who wanted to embarrass Putin and undermine Russia. And the chemical that was used, we've found, is actually pretty widely available and had been produced in Uzbekistan, which is a former Soviet republic. Another aspect of this crime is that Sergei Skripal, who had flipped to the Brits and went to Russian prison and then was exchanged for another spy, Anna Chapman, the Russian spy, his handler was someone named Pablo Miller. Pablo Miller was a British spy, an MI5 agent who worked at Orbis, the intelligence consulting firm, with who is his partner at that firm, Christopher Steele,
right,
the author of the Steele Report. And the British press was given an order by the MI5 that it was forbidden legally from reporting Pablo Miller's name after the Skripal poisoning. This is one of the most suspicious elements of an extremely suspicious crime. And it's not surprising that actually mainstream voices in the UK are beginning to suspect that somebody deployed this chemical actually to deepen the looming Cold War with Russia.
So let's talk a little bit about another dimension of this too. I mean, it's fascinating, but another dimension of it to me is, and I want to go back to the attacks on the left in this country, because I think it's so central to this whole narrative, because our intelligence community for decades has been looking for ways to suppress, with a great deal of success, left dissidents. There's documented evidence of St. Muller's FBI working with J.P. Morgan Chase to suppress Occupy demonstrations and so on. So this is not, and I'm talking about documentation being released under the Freedom of Information Act, not tinfoil stuff. So we know that the intelligence community in the United States wants to suppress the genuine left in this, the dissident left in this country. One thing that struck me a lot about all of this, and I mentioned this to you before, when you were on last time, the fact that so many mainstream Democrats seem to accidentally refer to Putin as a communist.
Yeah.
When he is ideologically not at all a communist, as far as I can tell. He's a free marketer, bearing in mind that Putin would not be in power had the United States not put Boris Yeltsin in power in the 1990s, and he's the ideological and power heir, as far as I can see, of Yeltsin. So why is it that so many Americans seem to think that everything tracks back to Russia and that Russia is still communist, which ideologically gives the perfect excuse once again to go after the left?
You know, I was down at this really sad protest outside the White House 3 nights ago called the Kremlin Annex. It's being put on by a former Hillary staffer named Adam Parkhomenko, who is kind of a Ukrainian nationalist, and he wants to imitate. I mean, he's marketing it as, another Maidan, another color revolution based on what Ukraine did in 2014, I guess minus the Nazi street muscle. And, he's actually planning it with a guy named Philippe Reines, who's another...
Oh, Hillary's hatchet man
exactly.
Toward the press, yeah.
And, and then Rosie O'Donnell was on stage, and they were singing The Fifth Dimension, and I was talking to people in the crowd.
The Fifth Dimension?
Yeah, like, let the sun shine.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Remember that?
Yeah, I do, yeah.
They're like, you find their records in every dollar bin in a thrift store, and that's kind of where they belong. Every dollar bin always has them and Engelbert Humperdinck.
Yeah, I was never a big fan. I remember when they came out, and I was never a big fan of either, to be honest with you. But in a pinch, I'd go with Engelbert.
I prefer Ferrante and Teicher. But
I prefer the Captain and Tennille, but okay.
I was about to drop that one. Okay, so they're doing this sad protest where there are like 200 people there. They're all holding signs that have Trump with a hammer and sickle. So like this gold-tinted oligarch is somehow a communist. But you look at Parkhomenko, who's like the see-me side of the Hillary campaign, and Philippe Reines. Reines actually worked at this group called Beacon Global, which is basically a collection of former CIA directors and national security state figures who are selling their services to both parties, and really represents the kind of bipartisan consensus on an interventionist foreign policy with absolutely no principles. They're in with the UAE, and they get money from the weapons industries, whatever. It really represents the confluence of the two forces that make up the Russiagate narrative and benefit from it. First, you have the kind of dead-ender Hillary people who need an excuse for losing to one of the most beatable candidates in American history, and they need someone to blame so they can sustain their sad careers. Like Robbie Mook now has this like protecting our digital democracy agenda. Like, why does that guy have a job at all? He should be out on the beach with a metal detector looking for loose change.
Do you know, let me just interrupt you for a second, that Robbie Mook wrote a piece for The Atlantic or someplace on why Hillary lost.
He should be in The Atlantic. He should just be like drifting around in The Atlantic.
I'm glad he didn't write the piece for some other magazine I could name, but because he'd probably be in them too. But first or second paragraph, he said, direct Russian government involvement in making sure Hillary lost with a hyperlink. But apparently nobody at The Atlantic clicked on the hyperlink, so I clicked on it, and it linked to an article about Macedonian teenagers acting on their own to set up fake news websites. So Robbie Mook, the guy who's going to save digital democracy, either doesn't know the difference between a Macedonian teenager who lives in a completely different country and has no association with the Russian government and the actual Russian government. So that's a guy that I guess is going to save online democracy.
Yeah, or he's just a complete hustler. But that's my
I had considered that possibility as well.
That's my point.
Right.
And he's getting money from Silicon Valley to do it. So, brilliant stuff. But then you have the kind of, the national security state, which wants to plunge us into a new Cold War and
Sure.
drive record defense budgets and get all of this money for Silicon Valley for new bogus cybersecurity initiatives, as well as offensive hybrid warfare initiatives. And they get all rewarded with contributorships on the cable news channels, which are now infested by John Brennan, James Clapper, Michael Hayden, pretty much all the principals of the intelligence agencies. So these two forces have converged into Russiagate. And the reason that I have really opposed this narrative is, one, because, as you said, I'm skeptical about everything. I still remember when progressives like to say they were in the reality-based community and they were interested in facts, and so am I. So I'm looking for facts, and there's the concrete evidence is often hard to find here, but it's also important, in my view, to avoid war. And the forces that I see really manipulating those sad people who are like this part of the Democratic base, this key part of the Democratic base, who are like semi-retired people in their late 60s and early 70s who have nothing better to do than watch MSNBC all the time, and they're just getting their brains hacked by Rachel Maddow, and they know nothing about the outside world. Those people are being manipulated by some of the most devious figures who have signed millions of lives away with pen strokes. And those are the people that I consider the enemy of the people. John Brennan, for example. John Brennan is the enemy of the people, and it needs to be said.
Well, you may have missed this, but I actually wrote a piece called "The Resistance Needs Better Heroes."
Yeah.
And I mentioned Brennan, I mentioned Mueller, and I mentioned Comey, and I mentioned, that's the other piece of it. I think we're probably going to do the whole thing on this, but that's fine. We'll certainly get to Nicaragua too, but it seems to me that the bizarre thing that's happened as a result of this is the elevation of people who have done Clapper is a documentable liar and perjurer before Congress.
He's a Vietnam era monster, is what he is as well.
Brennan is objectively pro-torture,
pro-drone. He was the drone assassination czar under Obama.
Right.
Like, who cares?
Mueller, has been involved in some of the FBI's worst behavior. So has Comey, and the idea. It never occurs to people, for example, to say, well, let's wait and see what Mueller finds, as opposed to I've quoted on this show prayers that people put online. Oh, angels of heaven, watch over Robert Mueller and keep him safe and well. How about we just follow his investigation and report what he finds and how credible it is? How about that? Just tossing that out there.
Following his investigation would actually be dangerous to the Russiagate narrative, because his big case, the only trial he's gotten that's really attracting national attention with Paul Manafort, the swamp creature, the quintessential swamp creature, has no mention of Russia in it.
You mean, wasn't he Tony Podesta's?
He got Tony Podesta a contract. Tony Podesta is like Hillary Clinton's right-hand man. He got him a contract to work in Ukraine under Yanukovych as part of the Engage Ukraine agenda, which was where he was trying to move this Ukrainian government that's constantly cast as pro-Russian into the arms of Europe against the wishes of Moscow. And now in his trial, the prosecution is formally forbidden from mentioning Russia, and the trial officially has nothing to do with Russia. So why is Mueller even doing it? I mean, what we really need is 1,000 Muellers in Washington to take Tony Podesta to trial, and everybody else who's making millions in this town with these sleazy foreign accounts, because what Manafort was doing is like part of the culture in the Beltway.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And as I've said from day one, I'm open to the possibility that there was deeper Russian involvement in the election than we are currently aware of. I mean, the Mueller indictment of the 13 Russian hackers was tricky because they'll never come here. There'll never be a trial. It'll never be tested in court of law.
But Concord Management, the Russian troll farm, did show up in court after Mueller indicted them.
That's right. Yeah,
and
tell us about that. Yeah, yeah.
Mueller indicted the Russian troll farm. This was another one of his big indictments. Concord Management, which is the company, the American holding company that represents the Internet Research Agency, which is the supposed troll farm in St. Petersburg, which took out these fraudulent Facebook pages, which I think had no effect on the election at all, but were manipulative. They showed up in court. And they said, we want a speedy trial. And Mueller tried to delay the trial. And now he's kicked the can down the road and is passing it on to other prosecutors because he will not be able to convict them, certainly not during the timeline of his investigation. He may not convict them at all. And he has refused discovery. He has actually refused to hand over hundreds of thousands of pages of unclassified information, because it is so potentially damning to his own investigation. So this is what happens when some Russians actually show up in court. Didn't work out well for Mueller, and no one wants to talk about this trial anymore. I mean, it's being reported maybe in a few legal blogs, but the papers aren't touching it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And by the way, Philippe Reines went after a friend of mine, the late Michael Hastings, and I still have a grudge against him for that, the journalist. Let's switch gears a little bit, though. You just got back from Nicaragua, where, among other things,
That was our 25-minute intro for Nicaragua.
Right. Okay. So before we go, in closing, we have a few minutes. Nicaragua. So how long were you there?
I was there for 2 weeks. It felt like a long 2 weeks.
And you were covering basically well, you tell me. I don't want to paraphrase you.
Well, a coup took place in Nicaragua, a very sophisticated coup that involved a lot of online manipulation, information warfare, combined with street armed criminal activity, armed kind of like militia-style activity, and traditional kind of color revolution-style protest activity with U.S.-backed students kind of fronting for the whole thing. And I went down to investigate what had actually happened. The country had been paralyzed by these roadblocks, which had cost it about $500,000 and had really terrorized a large part of the civilian population. The roadblocks weren't really well reported on in the U.S., although the New York Times referred to them as a form of resistance. And these were the kind of armed elements that I was talking about. So a lot of their arms were homemade, but they also had high-powered rifles as well. And they extorted motorists to pay for themselves, also got money from other, narco-trafficking rings. And they also killed a lot of people who were common Sandinistas, supporters of the Sandinista government of Daniel Ortega. And I went right after the last major roadblock where many Sandinistas had been shot, tortured, burned on camera. Horrible things had happened. Neighborhoods had been completely cut off. And so the country was kind of free to move again, and I was free to enter these areas and interview people about what had happened. And it was very disturbing. I would just meet droves of people, scores of people who had some of them still had like wounds. One man I met was missing an eye. I met an entire family that were just covered in bandages and traumatized because they had experienced the opposition's wrath because they were known supporters of the Sandinista movement. The Sandinista movement is one of the largest workers' movements for progressive social change in Latin America. It has 2 to 2.5 million members. It's really what makes Nicaragua an independent country. And the United States, through the Miami lobby, and right-wing forces in Nicaragua have sought to break this movement down ever since it emerged as a real powerful governing force in the 1980s, first through the Contras.
Right.
But what we saw here and what wasn't reported in our media is that the opposition did things that the Contras weren't even able to do, penetrating deep into Managua to attack people house by house simply for supporting that government. There was also violence on the government side to suppress this insurgency. But when I was there, the opposition was, its media channels were openly operating, calling for violence against Daniel Ortega, calling for his killing openly. Opposition marches were proceeding freely in the wealthy areas of Managua. And I didn't see this fascistic crackdown on them, but I did get to go to, for example, what used to be the #1 radio station in Managua. Was operating out of a kind of small place, like a place about the size of We Act Radio now. And I went to its former offices. They'd been completely torched by the opposition with all of its staff inside, 22 staff members. They managed to escape with their lives. The whole thing was burned. And this hasn't been reported anywhere in Western media. Right next to it was a credit union that served 100,000 poor people in Nicaragua, working people with small accounts, totally torched. I went to all sorts of homes of Sandinista community leaders and union leaders that had been torched in Masaya, a town near Managua. And what I saw was not something that was about deposing Daniel Ortega, who has definitely his flaws and definitely deserves criticism like any leader. It was about purging the Sandinistas from public life in Nicaragua. And the wall-to-wall Western media coverage has been so deceptive, but not dissimilar from the coverage we saw of Syria or Ukraine. It's really part and parcel of an influence operation that was waged on Nicaraguans and is being waged in the U.S. to kind of garner support for something that I think most progressive-minded Americans would absolutely not support.
I saw that you had also, speaking of U.S. involvement, that you had cornered, I have it here somewhere, but yeah, here it is. Today I asked USAID's Mark Green about the lethal violence of the opposition, his agency backs in Nicaragua, and he didn't answer the question, did he?
Well, this is something that, Americans don't really understand, but would help put Russiagate in a new light. We have an arm of our government that is dedicated explicitly to meddling in other countries' political systems, including and especially democratic societies, which are easiest to meddle with. So USAID, which is an arm of the State Department, helps oversee the National Endowment for Democracy, which trains opposition activists and funds opposition media, especially in countries where the U.S. wants their government out and wants to kind of foment a color revolution. Between 2014 and 2017, the National Endowment for Democracy spent over $4 million in Nicaragua. Mark Green of USAID recently met with one of the favorite NED grantees, one of the favorite grantees of the American government's meddling machine. His name is Felix Maradiaga. And I went to speak to Mark Green because he had just met with Maradiaga in Washington and pledged $1.5 million more to opposition media and activists, basically to gin up another coup. And Maradiaga had been filmed with armed men at a Nicaraguan university that had been taken over partly by armed elements, including a criminal network. And Maradiaga, he was standing next to a guy waving around a pistol in this video, and he looked like completely different than he looks when he goes to USAID. He looked basically like he was part of this. He was basically part of this gang. And then he, shows up in the U.S. shaved with a three-piece suit on, meeting the USAID director. So I went to this meeting at the Council of the Americas. Seated behind me were like Trump Latin America officials, Roger Noriega, who was Bush's man on Latin America, who attempted to overthrow the Cuban government. And I got up and asked Mark Green about the proximity of his own grantees to the lethal violence in Nicaragua, and he completely ducked the question. But I mean, this is such an important thing to understand when you look at the assassination attempt on Nicolas Maduro. You look at so many
president of Venezuela. Yeah.
President of Venezuela. You look at the sonic attacks in Cuba. The U.S. is employing so many bizarre measures to undermine these governments, some of which are not really fully socialist. Like Nicaragua is a mixed economy that has a lot of space for the business community, but just to get it to basically dominate Latin America.
And of course, this has a very, very, very long history. Going
back to the Monroe Doctrine. But, we're looking at today, it's not the palace coup or the straight up, just straight up assassination. It's very sophisticated, and it requires also fomenting popular protest in combination with street muscle and now online manipulation.
Which is a tactic that goes back to at least to Salvador Allende's overthrow in the early 1970s. Unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there, but where can people go to get more about what you've done in Nicaragua?
Well, grayzoneproject.com is where all my reporting can be found, and we also have a new episode up at Moderate Rebels. Basically, just Google Moderate Rebels Radio or go to Moderate Radio on Twitter, and we have a new episode on Nicaragua that I think people will find very informative.
Good. Okay. I encourage people to do that. And as always, Max Blumenthal, great to talk with you.
You too.